Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing Homeland with Dale Maharidge. I'm Pat Zerke, director of the Forum. For 38 years, we've been bringing you the issues and ideas that are shaping our world. Reporting from Middle America, author Dale Maharidge and photographer Michael Williamson have created Homeland, a troubling and revealing narrative of the impact of 9/11 on the United States. They logged thousands of miles across the country and uncovered the emotions of a deeply divided people seeking security in a world turned upside down. How does the pervasive economic downturn of the last 30 years produce the flag-waving, bellicose displays of patriotism that swept the country after 9/11? What does history teach us about the kinds of leadership and social policies necessary to stem the current tide of violence and authoritarianism? Dale Maharidge has collaborated with Michael Williamson to produce 4 earlier books, including Journey to Nowhere, the saga of the new underclass, which inspired Bruce Springsteen to write 2 songs, and the 1990 Pulitzer Prize winner for nonfiction, And Their Children After Them. Maharidge is currently on leave from the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University. He's working on a new book about a small town in Iowa and about to leave for Yaddo to work on a new novel. So welcome to Cambridge Forum, Dale Maharidge.
It's a very important night here. I was explaining to the person who introduced me that this is the very last event on this book tour, and for this book, essentially, which began 3 years ago, when I was moved to New York in August 2001 to teach at Columbia University. I was teaching at Stanford, and I needed a change, so I headed east. So I started teaching my class, and then the night of September 10th, Michael Williamson, my photographic collaborator, had called me. We were talking about some business. I was working on the novel that was mentioned, and I went to bed about 3:30 in the morning, and I woke up at 9-something, and my message machine was blinking. And I hit play. It was Michael saying, "Oh my gosh, get to your rooftop." I ran to my rooftop, and I got there just as the second tower went down. I watched it fall, and I watched the billowing cloud over Lower Manhattan, and it's not writerly license that I say this, but I turned to the west and looked at the New Jersey Palisades, and I wondered about what Philip Roth, the novelist Philip Roth, calls the indigenous American berserk. I knew it was going to be unleashed. I knew what I was going to be doing. I don't know what it was going to be, but I knew I had to document this somehow. And that's my talk tonight is going to revolve around some of these issues, these deep issues that were brought up in my introduction. I never went to Ground Zero. I had a student who had a friend on one of the planes that went into the towers. I consoled her that afternoon. It was very personal, very emotional, obviously, to be in New York at that time. I grew very ill in the coming months. I developed World Trade cough, even though I lived 100 blocks distant. I was coughing blood by December. I was very weak. I thought I had tuberculosis from the years of living with the homeless for the books we did in the 1980s. I went to a doctor, and a battery of tests proved otherwise. So I started this book with not the greatest of health, but I had some key areas I went to in this country. These are untold stories that you did not read about in the national media. I went where no one else went. I went where the anger in America is located. One of my focus communities was the southwest suburbs of Chicago. There's a town called Bridgeview. There's a mosque there, a rather large mosque. There are between 60 and 80,000 Muslims in the adjoining suburbs. And on 9/11, that night, and for 3 nights, thousands, perhaps as many as 9,000 or 10,000 whites, stormed that mosque with the intent to burn it down or destroy it or do damage. And it took police from 10 departments to keep them at bay. That was written about in the Chicago papers, but the national press didn't touch it. Everything was focused on the East, of course. I wasn't, of course, there at that period, but I went back a year later. I wanted to get at the root of why these people were doing this. Was it just plain old racism? Was it anti-Arab? What were the underlying reasons? And I went on the anniversary, and I showed up, and there were hundreds, not thousands, but hundreds of whites reenacting the storming. And there were just as many police officers. They had police probably from 20 departments there. And it was a bitter, vicious scene. Hundreds of American flags, people chanting, USA, USA, towards the direction of the mosque. as if the Arab Americans weren't citizens. Now, the reporters who covered it from the local press did the superficial story. And on the surface, these are a bunch of racist whites who want to, burn down a mosque. I wanted to get to the deeper story. So there was a mother named Nancy and her son Jim. She was 56, he was 35. And they clutched American flags, and the police ordered them home, and they righteously were just angry. How about this is our very freedoms. I couldn't interview them, of course, but I got their phone number. And 2 months later, I was back in Chicago, and I went to their door. Nancy answered. I'd called ahead, and Jim had said, come on over. Nancy answered the door, and it was a snowy night. It was cold. She was very distant, and I thought, this is not going to be a good interview. I go into the kitchen with the mom, and the son comes in, Jim, and he starts spouting off, and for an hour he just bleats racist, the usual racist stuff. If you're a journalist, you couldn't publish it. It's just, we know this, we know what he said. And I started talking about other issues, and another hour went by, and then we started getting somewhere. Nancy spoke up for the first time. She pulled back her top, and on her shoulder was an OxyContin pain patch. Turns out her knee is blown out. She works for J.C. Penney for $7 an hour, has lousy health insurance, and the HMO has been stalling and giving her an implant. She's in miserable pain. The son says, Jim says, excuse me. He goes into the bedroom, comes out with a shopping bag stuffed with papers. It looks like the kind of bag you recycle. It's his medical bills, $200,000 in medical bills. He floods it on the table. He has no insurance. The deeper underlying anger is their health is miserable. They have no health care. Everybody that I talked to, I found many others who stormed the mosque. Every other white person I found had the same kind of issues. Medical, no jobs, underemployed, working at Walmart. Nobody was out there who was making lots of money and who was doing well. And this goes into something that I get into in the book where I talk about, Michael and I did these books in the 1980s on poverty. We did a book called Journey to Nowhere, the one that Bruce Springsteen did the 2 songs from. We did a book called And Their Children After Them, the one on the sharecroppers that won the Pulitzer. We did a book called The Last Great American Hobo, about an octogenarian hobo in his last days of his life. But they were all themed on poverty, and we were burned out on it. And what we found in the 80s was basically we found despair. We didn't find much else. And I, frankly, wasn't going to cover this kind of work anymore. In 1995, Bruce Springsteen called and said, hey, I'm using your songs for inspiration. Do you want to meet? Sure, we met. And he asked what he could do to help, and he said, I'll write an introduction to your book if you want me to. That got us back. Bruce got us back out on the road. We wouldn't have done it if it hadn't been for Bruce. When we went back on the road, it was a different America. That's where we found seething anger. And I was back in Youngstown, Ohio. It was our necropolis for Journey to Nowhere. 40,000 high-paid steelworking jobs were lost in the early 80s in Youngstown, Ohio. And of course, what replaced those jobs? Today, if you go to Youngstown, there are 4 prisons, some of them located in the sites of the mill. Prison jobs are what have replaced steelworker jobs. I was back in Youngstown with this professor who had helped us, John Russo, and he took us down to where one of the mills had been, the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Works. It was gone. And we'd been there in the early 80s. And Michael was taking a before and after picture. And I look over to the side, and John's weeping. He's bawling. And I says, John, are you okay? He says, guys, he says, I haven't been here since you were here. That mill site is 2 miles from his house. And this is what he told me that day. He said, there's a lot of anger in working people, John says. It's not unlike the anger in pre-war Germany and pre-war Italy. In the 1930s, America could have gone in either direction. He meant towards Franklin Roosevelt or extreme nationalism. During the Depression, Father Charles Coughlin and his radio hate ministry thrived and had some 10 million listeners. A number of Americans supported Adolf Hitler. John points out that both communists and capitalists despised Roosevelt. But capitalists allowed themselves to be saved by FDR because communism was then a credible threat. There had been the Bolshevik Revolution 15 years earlier, John notes. Now there's no threat from the left. Capitalism has nothing to worry about. We went on our way and finished our reporting. We reissued Journey to Nowhere. And I put it in the book, but I kind of dismissed John. It's a little extreme. We're not like the Germany in the 30s. It just doesn't make any sense. I see the anger, but I don't see it going that direction. Well, the morning I stood on my rooftop, I looked to the west. I talked about the indigenous American berserk, as Roth says. That's what I knew was going to be unleashed. I said, oh my gosh, that anger is what I've got to document. And so that's what I was looking at when I went to places like Chicago. And what we have in America now is we have this, the closest historical parallel. Like we've heard this is our generation's, World War II. This is our generation's 1930s, I posit. And I posit it based on history, based on empirical evidence of having spent the last 25 years with Michael Williamson. It was a quarter of a century we worked together documenting these people, the working class of America, living in their homes, going to work with them, riding freight trains as hobos with them. Bottom and top, I come to this conclusion. And a little history lesson might be in order. If you remember your history books, the Germany in the 1920s, we remember pictures of Germans carting bushel baskets and wheelbarrows of money to buy a loaf of bread. 4 billion marks to the US dollar. And the reason that happened was, of course, Germany lost World War I. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 basically set up a new Germany, a democratic Germany for the first time in its history, in the city of Weimar, and it was known as the Weimar Republic. Well, the Weimar Republic was weak. The right was very angry for having lost the war. It battled Weimar constantly. But Weimar took care of the rich at the expense of the working class. There were tax cuts for the rich. There were all sorts of breaks for the rich. If you had debts, you could pay off on those worthless marks. And so the inflation was great if you had lots of war debts. So the capitalists and the industrialists thrived under Weimar. The working class suffered. Of course, we know history. Mr. Hitler emerged and agitated. And he had quite a following. But then things changed because the American Dawes Plan softened reparations. And then we had investment. There were several $1 billion of U.S. investment in Germany. And things were pretty good by 26, 27, 28. In the 28 election, Hitler's party got like 2-point-some% of the vote. Nothing. They were marginalized. They were irrelevant. And of course, we know 1929, the global economic collapse. Boom. The anger was waiting to erupt. And it erupted in its own way. History never repeats itself exactly. I'm not saying that Hitler's going to rise in America. But you look to America in the 30s for a closer parallel. As I mentioned from John Russo, we had a lot of people who liked Hitler. Philip Roth has a new book out. People don't realize that Lindbergh, he was a Hitler admirer, got a medal from the dictator. He loved Hitler. Henry Ford loved Hitler. Coughlin had 10 million radio listeners. My grandfather was one of them. My grandfather was terribly anti-Semitic. And there was this anger and hatred being fed in the 30s. And, America could have gone either direction. FDR came in. He didn't get the people on the far right. You're never going to get them. America was apportioned into thirds. A third was, anything from very, very conservative to fascist. The middle was whatever. The other third was kind of progressive to communist. And as Roosevelt said, I like to make us go slightly to the left of center. That was his motto. He didn't need to win 60 or 70% of the populace. He needed to win 50 plus 1%. Of course, the New Deal was very rough. It started poorly. It didn't offer a lot of it offered hope, but not much in actuality until the late 30s. It inspired Sinclair Lewis in 1936 to publish It Can't Happen Here, about a fascist takeover of the United States. That's still tenuous in 36, but by 38, 39, things were softening up, and Roosevelt won, and we were saved. I just did a piece for The Nation magazine about 3 weeks ago on the cover, which I ended the piece, if Mr. Kerry becomes president, he better find his inner FDR. And if he doesn't, somebody else better come along and find his inner FDR, because we need a Franklin Roosevelt today. This is a volatile time in our history. We're going to decide, as a society, what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to be a country of hate and lashing out and ever spiraling darkness? Or do we want to find some answers to these problems? Now, we have two issues going on here. This anger I talk about in America, which, again, if you want to document it, remember, folks, in 1980, there were only 75 all-talk stations in the United States. Almost none of them were hate radio. There are now 1,300 all-talk stations in America. Most of them are pretty nasty shows. It's a free market response to the hatred I posit. So these guys have come in, you know, the Rush Limbaughs and Michael Savages, and spewed this anger out there, and people are angry. They are angry, but they're also afraid, and there's cause for being afraid. I mean, we were attacked. When you mix anger and fear, you got trouble. Now, I don't have the answer for the fear, but I do have an answer for the anger. We have to take care of working class Americans again. We have to think about people, and again, people in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, and early 90s, these issues got couched in terms of, oh, they're all on welfare. Remember, folks, at peak, something like 3 to 4% of Americans were on welfare. As I speak to you now, less than 2% are on welfare. Most people who are poor are the working poor. They're working at Walmart. I've stood in food lines with them and gone home. I was in Al Gore's backyard in 2000, excuse me. I followed a man home from a food bank who worked on the Gore farm. He had one potato at that point in his refrigerator. He had an 11-year-old boy. He was working. I had a woman who worked for the state of Texas who had a daughter who had medical problems, who had her own Habitat for Humanity house, who had a head of cabbage and a few bags of rice at her house, working full time. We have to take care of those people, and if we do, we'll soften that anger. So like that mother and son I told you about, are they not going to become racists? I doubt it. But maybe if they had health care, and maybe if she had a better job, would they be out wanting to burn a mosque down? Perhaps not. So we're talking about margins. We're not going to win 100% of America over to a course of sanity. I'm not even going to call it a Democrat-Republican course. What I'm talking about defies traditional labels. This is not liberal nor Democrat. I have conservatives in my book, right-wingers, white nationalists, who tell me they'll work with Farrakhan to preserve our liberties. I have people who are former liberals who are warriors. The old paradigms are out. We have to think in terms of how do we create a sane course for this country. I'm going to close with a letter to a friend. This book became very personal. I had a friend of 40 years. We're in our first communion photo in Ohio, standing next to each other. He got married and moved away, but it stayed tight. Matter of fact, it grew tighter as time went on. But 40 years went by, and after 9/11, he started near the end. He started going into the Bible. And I don't mean Bible in terms of just religion, but in the fundamentalist, kind of hardcore kind of way. And I'll read something he told me. I was just finishing this book, and he had called me in New York City. I was back living in New York City, and he said, "I know where you stand," he snapped. We hadn't talked in months, but he knew of this book. He proceeded to disparage liberals and Democrats for wanting to do nothing to protect the country. Cowardly, he said. He was for war against Iraq and for other countries to follow. I shot back that I didn't want anyone questioning my patriotism. I wasn't prepared for this assault. I went on about all the reasons why going it alone like cowboys in a cheap Western was a recipe for self-destruction. They hate us anyway. Why not go at them? We've whacked the beehive. There's spray. When the bees come back, spray them, exterminate them. That's what Arabs understand, power. You show them. If that doesn't work, kill them. Kill them all. They're going to hate us no matter what we do. Well, I hung the phone up after this conversation, and months went by. I couldn't finish the book. I didn't know how to respond. All what I'm writing about, all these came home to me in this 40-year friendship. And I wrote a letter to my friend, and I can't read it, obviously, because it's way too long. I'll just read you the end. And I'll stop there. I'll close with a proverb emailed to me by the writer and editor Tom Engelhardt not long after 9/11 about a Native American grandfather and his grandson. The grandfather tells the boy he is troubled. I feel as if I have two wolves fighting in my heart, the grandfather says. One wolf is the vengeful, angry, violent one. The other wolf is a loving, compassionate one. Which wolf will win the fight in your heart, Grandpa? The one I feed.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum listening to Dale Maharidge discussing Homeland. I want to go back to your career as a journalist. What responsibilities do you think the media have for either reinforcing or allaying the fears of Americans? Have they lived up to their responsibilities? And what would you have done differently? I mean, we know what you did do differently for yourself, but what would you have done differently if you had been in charge of CBS or Clear Channel?
Wow, we don't have 2 hours to answer that question, Blake. I have a lot of thoughts on that. I teach journalism, of course, at Columbia University, and I teach my students how to practice a certain kind of journalism that deals with these kind of issues. Editors are terrified of these issues. I was embarrassed to say I taught journalism for the first 2 years after 9/11. The American media let down the American public. There was very little questioning. The people I'm telling you about were not in the press. I didn't read about them. There's other cases of repression and political rights taken away that were ignored. Not only ignored, but squelched. And a lot of reporters, my students, were out there and they were calling me frustrated. They wanted to cover these issues. But the editors were fighting the war. They were thinking what Americans needed to hear, not what they wanted to hear, not what they needed to hear. So I like to use my book as a bully pulpit to talk to editors. Don't let this happen again, because we really, really, really fell down. And a lot of papers are only now beginning to marginally pick up some of the slack. There's still a long way to go to have this full story out there, what's going on.
Your basic argument seems to be that 9/11 was not a turning point. Everything wasn't different on 9/12, but it amplified or it intensified pre-existing emotions. It changed, it took fears and anger that already existed, and it brought them out into the open. Is that a fair assessment?
This has been an evolution. This anger building has been an evolution. 9/11, I think, was like a trigger, but it wasn't an overnight thing. The anger's been out there. Look at the Columbine-like school shootings. This rage of different levels of our society, and it's usually young white men doing these things. So no, it's been there, but again, the press wasn't reporting on it.
So, could you list? You talked about a few of the factors that feed this anger, feed the fear. Could you list some of the panoply of factors that cause the anger in young white men or young black men?
Well, okay, there's different kinds of levels. You have the guy who lost his job in Youngstown, who's now laying carpet for 4 hours a day for minimum wage. Went from $15 an hour to 5-something an hour. And he has a sense of loss, and he's bitter. But you have the man's son, who sees his dad living this way. And I've been back in Youngstown. I was just back in Youngstown several days ago. You have the young men who see their dad in this situation. What hope do you have when you turn 19, 19, 20? So a lot of times they just give up before they even start. There's a real sense of hopelessness. And so you have the initial rage of the man who lost a steel job, and he watched the steel mill being blown up. You have the quiet, subtle rage of the kid who has no future. Or, to put it at a different level, it's not just people like that. In Columbine-like situations, I was speaking in Portland, Oregon at Powell's Books, and a fellow came up after and he says, I agree with you on what you'd say about the working class, but he says, I'm a software engineer, and I see incredible rage among my colleagues because they're afraid of losing their jobs. So the fear manifests, if that's one, and of course racism is a whole other type of fear, that's another lecture, but each kind of fear, it is a panoply of fear. They come together into this big ugly mess. You can't deal with it as an ugly mess. You've got to deal with each component. But you have to deal with it in terms of almost, not simple solutions, but concrete solutions. The left of the 1930s, of course, was beaten in the 20s. The Palmer raids of 1919, 1920, Woodrow Wilson, scaring up nationalism for World War I. All through the 20s, the left organized. By the 30s, they were pretty organized. And the left they went for bread and butter issues. Jobs, jobs, jobs. And I think, you have to take care of jobs first, and then we can work on a whole bunch of other stuff. One program that I'm really keen on is the Apollo Alliance. It's a consortium of 12 labor unions, and they're proposing an Apollo-like program and put the man on the moon from 1960 to 1969 to put America back to work and create 3 million jobs. For a portion of Bush's tax cuts to the rich, you would fund the Apollo Alliance, alternative vehicles, alternative fuels, and you'd have 3 million jobs. Okay, well, you get that many jobs created that are paying $15, $20, $25 an hour. Then we could talk about education, funding other issues. But we've got to start with the fundamentals.
You're listening to Dale Maharidge discussing Homeland. We'll now take some questions from the audience, and if you'd like to line up at the central mic.
Considering the powerlessness of the poor sector and considering that this is an election year, do they see that as a vehicle to righting any wrongs, or do they just take a passive kind of position around that as well? And who would they vote for?
Well, by the time the radio audience hears this, we'll know what we'll almost know what the election is. The results are. Neither side is talking about some of these real issues. The Democrats are much to blame as the Republicans, as far as I'm concerned. It's been avoided because I don't know if it's because it sounds soft, like, oh, you're not talking, being muscular in foreign policy. You're talking about fuzzy things like creating jobs, or it's just too complex for Americans to understand, and the candidates don't want to touch it. But they're not. Neither side's talking about it.
So you also feel that the poor would not try to empower themselves by voting. They don't see that as a vehicle. And also the poor, do they feel like there is some kind of panacea out there for them? And do you feel that since 9/11, there was maybe there was more despair before? Are you saying among the poorer sector that they're enraged enough to organize themselves in a better fashion? Or
remember, any revolution in history has always been started by the middle class. The poor in any culture, they're surviving. It's the hardest. Your question, I was asked earlier today, actually, and yesterday in New York City. Your question is the hardest to answer because I would like to think, oh yeah, the poor are going to become educated, they're going to get involved, they're going to go out and vote. There are record numbers of registrations in places like Ohio. People are going out and registering, and we may see an uptick of sorts. But remember, when you're surviving, when you're that single mom, and you're trying to put food on the table, and like Maggie in Texas, the woman I told you about, she is working 2 jobs. She can't afford a lawnmower. She cuts her lawn with scissors. And she's very intelligent. Actually, I think she is somewhat engaged. But for most people who are living that way, you're not going to go go to the Cambridge Forum and talk that night. You're going to go to sleep and get up for the job. So in a way, I don't fault them. I wish it were different, but it's not.
Hey, Dale. Dave Beard. There's a bunch of journalism students in the audience, too, and if you were playing at your old job at Sacramento at the Bee as assignment editor, could you give them a few ways to sort of discrete ways to get their hands around portions of the problem as you see it?
Well, you have to tie it to the news. I was talking to some of your students before we started talking here about ways they could get at these stories. There's, okay, you're working at a newspaper and a report comes in about, statewide job numbers. You go to your editor and you say, I'm going to find out some of these people who've fallen off the rolls. You hook it to the news, and even editors who don't want to hear these kinds of stories. Well, that sounds like a good story. Sure, you go out and do it, and you get the human voices in the paper. It's human voices we need to hear, and I think this raises a larger issue than just journalism. Is that we don't have dialogue in this country anymore. In this book, I talk to white nationalists, and I don't agree with them, but I treat them with respect because you know what? On 70% of things, I'll tell a quick story. I was in Chicago, and this guy named Mark, World Church of the Creator. It's one of the 2 main white nationalist groups, and they're totally racist, totally. And I didn't think he would talk to me, so I emailed Mark. I had an email, and I said, "Hi, I'm Dale Maharidge, and you're going to Google me and say I'm a liberal journalist, but I want to talk to you and hear what you have to say." He emailed back and said, "Yes, let's meet." We met at a restaurant called Phoenix in Chicago, and we sat down, and he blew me away when he's a 19-year-old guy. He looked at me and said, we agree on more things than you think. I'm a socialist, and I don't mean national socialist. I'm an environmentalist. I'm a strong union person. We just disagree about race. And we take race out of the equation, this guy, he's a progressive liberal. Now, I'm not going to win Mark over. He's gone. But people who are, conservative, who aren't racist, we have a lot of the same wants. If you start talking, and remember, in Bowling for Columbine, the smartest person in Michael Moore's movie, Bowling for Columbine, was Marilyn Manson. When he was blamed for the Columbine shootings, and Michael Moore went into his dressing room and asked him, what do you have to say to the parents of the kids? He said, I wouldn't say anything. I'd listen. We got to listen more in this country.
I'm not as familiar as many people are here with your work, so I'm just going to tell you quickly my story and ask for you to respond. I'm a person who has worked with children in after-school care programs so parents can work and children have a good program. And I've worked in Massachusetts, and I also worked in England when I lived there. I'm trained to teach music in schools. I have become progressively less able or more affected, impacted by my arthritis. As of April of this year, I became registered disabled. I am being asked to live on under $700 a month. On the 30th of September, I would have been absolutely homeless. I mean absolutely homeless, underscore, had it not been for the charity of a young couple, the wife of whom has cystic fibrosis and has made it to 25. And I am struggling in their home, trying to accommodate myself to their, hospitality but limitations, and carry on trying to retrain through some support through Mass Rehab Commission, of which I think there are many other states that have these commissions. It will take me 3 years. I will be 58 by the time I complete the 3-year qualification in remedial ed. I am not alone in being a person who has been on housing lists since 1999 in 4 cities, and I'm being told that I'm not an emergency, I am not a priority, and that I'm not old enough to be considered elderly. There are 48,000 of us on waiting lists for homes, and I have a 6-month maximum limit as a guest. I don't have to wait to be convinced that I'm not being noticed.
I don't know what to add to that. I would like to say some things about it that were on the air, and I can't. But yes, you're exactly the kind of person I'm talking about.
A couple points. Number one, I'm angry too, but I'm not angry with Arab Americans. I'm angry with the rich who are stealing this world from us. So my question, but I have a few comments afterwards, is why is the anger so misdirected? And it seems in the U.S., in Brazil, I've spent time with the landless people movement. These are poor people who are starving, who are in even worse shape than many people in our country, and they have a completely different progressive vision of a world that they're fighting for, and see the connections. When I was there, they asked me questions about our foreign policy, and these are people who were completely illiterate. Mm-hmm. And even in Canada, my one final point, I thought the best moment in Bowling for Columbine was when he asks the young, kind of punk-looking kids in Canada, like, do you think that the government should have, like, a health service? And they look at him like he's crazy, because of course, like, what a stupid question.
The question was on anger, misdirected. The Republicans, starting with Barry Goldwater, learned how to use the code language to get at these issues. Everything from busing to Willie Horton to quotas, all the little code words you hear. Nobody uses the overt racism. At the same time, concurrently, the Democrats had no message at all. And the Republicans took over the stage. The word liberal became a swear word, as an invective. I could say, being a liberal means people having good jobs and having health care and eating and children having good education. That's a liberal. I guess you can call me that. It is misdirected, but somebody has to offer the voice, the solution. And the journalists can only go so far in raising the questions. Leadership is important.
You spoke about teaching in Columbia University and your students, the way they reacted post 9/11. I'm curious about, in light of other media, do you find censor themselves, and if they do, to speak what they think people want to hear, what is the motivation behind that among young people?
I'm not the person to ask because, frankly, I've taught at elite university. I've taught at Stanford. I teach at Columbia. The kind of student we get there is in your face with questions and comments and thoughts. When I have talked to schools, I've been living in Iowa the last year in a new book project. It's a whole different ballgame there. I mean, the students are reflective of their parents. They're not engaged.
Why do you think that is?
Same answer I had before, the stumbling. No one really has the answer because they're surviving, the parents are surviving. No one's really teaching them to read, critically, and they just sort of are existing. So they're reflective of their parents often. But again, I'm not the person to ask what the university is. I'm teaching in the wrong places to answer that question.
Hi. I'm sort of curious what you were just saying about basically the people being kind of the core of the issue, like the woman with the scissors cutting her grass, not being able to come to events like this. And so I was wondering if you think this sort of forum, like, does it frustrate you to talk to people who already agree? And what do you think that a group of people who mostly already agree ought to take away from this? And who would you rather be reaching?
Well, you must be one of the journalism students. That's a very good question. This is not a waste because, look, the people who are here in this room, people who are listening on the radio, are the type of people who are engaged, who are reaching, and there are ways to reach out. Again, it's not easy. With race, for instance, I was asked the same kind of question. I did a book called The Coming White Minority. California is now a white minority state. The whole country is going to be white minority in the next 40 years. And it's dialogues. It's getting out in the community. It's creating places where intersections can happen. Again, maybe if we offer jobs, like an Apollo Alliance type thing, with that we maybe have, part of the participation or the price of admission is they have to come to meetings and talk about their jobs. Therefore, they maybe can learn about bigger issues. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to engage people. I know in Youngstown, Ohio, I was just over the summer. It's actually Lordstown, Ohio, near Youngstown. The auto workers plant. A union guy came up to me after my talk there and said, "Man, we were almost in fist fights at our union hall." And he said, Bush, Kerry. I mean, finally we just said, "Look, guys, we're going to have an hour a week. We're going to talk and let our hair down." He says, "It's been really productive since then." So there's workplace, school place. We can have dialogues happen. But it takes energy on the part of people like us here and us who are listening to start those dialogues.
What responsibility do you think, if any, the entertainment industry has in getting out viewpoints or encouraging discussion or expressing themselves or just their choice of entertainment? Well,
unfortunately, this country is a celebrity-driven country, and for good or ill. And, of course, we hear the fact, the Hollywood liberals are always doing things and speaking out. But I only noticed, conservative actors become governors and presidents. I live in California part of the year, and Arnold Schwarzenegger is not exactly a liberal. No, I think that everybody should be involved. I think it's erroneous for us to rely on celebrities to be spokespeople or to lead because you look back in the 60s, people who were doing leading like Abby Hoffman came out of, college campuses. I mean, there's all sorts of ways. But there's also people who are union organizers in unheralded little places that the journalism students here will be going out to work in. They got to find these people and put a little spotlight on them and say, look what this person's doing. Wow, isn't this cool? Leadership's in all levels, not just celebrity.
How would you say the racism and this backlash sort of thing ties in with the religion? You said the white church of the creator and so what.
Well, religion's interesting because, a lot of people on the left just say, oh, religion, poo-poo. I was in Iowa, living in this little town. It's a book called The White Buffalo Prophecy, and it's about Latinos moving into this little town in Iowa. It's a meatpacking area. And there's a lot of racial tensions there, and there's all sorts of troubles. And, of course, 9/11 happens, and they're afraid of being attacked themselves. And there's a sheriff, Tom Hogan, really cool guy. I met him at a Rotary Club when I spoke there. And he said, let's get together sometime, Dale. And, yeah, whatever, he's a cop. I'm sort of a biased journalist. Cops are usually pretty conservative. And, what's he going to tell me, And I see him in town, little town. Hey, let's get together. So a few months before I'm leaving, I said, hey, Tom, let's get together. So we went out driving. He said, you got some time? I said, sure. We spent a whole day driving around the county. And at one point he asked me, he says, what do you think about the war in Iraq, Dale? And this is a hot-button issue in Iowa because people don't talk about it. It's just not discussed. And people who do talk about it are for it. I said, you really want to know, Tom? He says, yes. I said, I think it was an unmitigated disaster. He says, exactly. And I said, so what's your take? And he said, that Rotary Club you spoke to, with 30 people in it, brotherly love, I was the only person against the war. And he started talking about all this. He started talking about quoting Gandhi, and then he talked about this. He grew up in Minnesota, and there was an Indian tribe that was suppressed back in the 1800s, and they had a trading post, and the Indians were starving in the winter, and the trading post guy wouldn't give the Indians any food, and he told them, eat grass. So there's an uprising about a month later, and they found the trading post owner dead with grass stuffed in his mouth. And I'm thinking, Tom, you sound like you're some lefty from San Francisco. Actually, he's not. He's exceptionally conservative. He came through it through his Lutheran religion. He says it's against my Christian ideals. He was not traditional left at all. Grew up very conservative. But he just can't countenance with his religion. So religion is a very funny thing. It's used by people, like the World Church of the Creator or some people, other groups. And they claim to speak for all religion, but they don't. It's much more complex than that. And I think most people who have true religious belief are not like those people. I know it because I talked to them.
Phrase, you said it's used by people. And Al Gore gave a speech in New York last spring called The Uses and Misuses of Fear. Who do you see using this fear, using this anger, using religion, using racism, and to what end are they being used?
It goes back to the Goldwater argument. If you want to get elected, you can pander to this. It's the lowest common denominator. You get to that lowest base. You use Willie Horton. You use the fear of 9/11 to say, I'm the guy to lead you. And your policies really aren't that good. But again, people who don't really read, they just watch TV and hear sound bites. It's like, yeah, he's the guy for us. I don't know about this other entity. So it's and it's not just America, every culture. Argentina during the Falklands. There's a great book by Chris Hedges. I don't know if he spoke here, The War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. One of the most important books written in the last 15 years. He talks about this commonality. It's almost like a fascist gene complex. We all have as humans in every culture. We have to fight it, guard against it all the time. Otherwise, it'll rise and take us over. It's one of those movies where the creature comes out of your chest and swallows you, and you don't become yourself anymore. We have to guard against it. One more?
Mm-hmm. I'd just like to share something that was said at the last Cambridge Forum by Mr. Paulo. And I wanted to address this especially to the young lady there. He floated an idea that in the face of fear, we should have hope. And I thought that was very awesome, because if you can have hope, you can prevent a lot of paralysis mentally and emotionally. But I do agree with him that you do have to keep hoping, and he utilized the word, you have to be persistent. So if you are 58 years old, put your age aside, don't worry about your age, and as long as you can get up in the morning, you hope, and you look at your issues and try to do something about them. Take some action every day to reduce the anxiety also. But hope, I think, will save us. I think we have been assaulted as a culture. The 9/11 totally assaulted us, and we're going to have to do a lot of operationalizing of concepts and things maybe that we were accustomed to will not be readily available right away, because we're going to have to go through a transitional period and redefine ourselves.
Yes.
But I really had an appreciation of the word hope, and I want to thank you for having invited the guest speakers, and I really grow from this forum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You talked a lot about specific bread and butter issues, fears of the working class. I have a fear too, and you haven't touched on it directly, but my fear is that the Constitution is being taken away from us, that the Bill of Rights is being taken away from us, that these bread and butter issues are being manipulated to a greater end, and that American democracy will turn out to be something like Weimar German democracy. Do you see echoes of that fear in your journeys across America?
Oh, very much so. The first thing that how come the Patriot Act, this 100-some page document, is done in 6 days? I kind of think that was done beforehand. I'm not saying that in a conspiracy way, but there's always a willingness. There was in the 1960s they tried to have a similar kind of act. There's always a tendency at governments of all stripes to suppress freedoms. It's easy, and there's a certain percentage of the population who wants to be suppressed. They want order. Remember Mussolini made the trains run on time in the 1920s Italy. He was loved for that, even though he did all kinds of bad things for human rights. The Constitution is a fragile document. We've got to fight for it every day. Some of the people in the book, there's a young woman I wrote about named Katie Sierra. I didn't mention her in the main talk, but Katie, not long after 9/11, they were bombing in Afghanistan, and there was a misplaced, one of those smart bombs went dumb and hit a little house and killed some children. She saw this on CNN. Now, she lived in Charleston, West Virginia. She's half Panamanian. Her high school had 700 students. Only 2 were non-white. Very conservative school. Confederate flags all over the place. Confederate flags in the kids' trucks. But she was so outraged. She was a believer in anarchy, and to her, anarchy meant peace. There was a peace group on the web that she belonged to. So she scrawled on her shirt, "When I saw the dead and dying Afghani children on TV, I felt a newly recovered sense of national security. God bless America." Third block English class. Kid screams at her, all the obscenities you can imagine, and they're sent down to the principal's office, and guess who? And she didn't say anything. Guess who got expelled? Katie, for 3 days. So she decided, I'm going to go to the school board, to the real adults, and state my case. 15-year-old girl. Her mom's conservative. Her mother has 2 brothers in the military, and her father was in Vietnam. And I use the word was, because Amy Sierra is no longer conservative, but she was conservative. So really had no support. Went to the school board, 15-year-old girl, and started stating her case. And she said, I read about the Constitution, in government class last week. I kind of thought it meant something. And the place erupted, hissing, screaming. They called her anti-American, USA, USA, all that stuff. It hit the papers and the right-wing hate radio, and she became pilloried in public. People would scream at her. Her mother got accosted at work. She was a nurse. And so she sued for her First Amendment rights. And I covered the trial gavel to gavel. And here's where hope is, because in that period in America, a 15-year-old girl is standing up, and Senator Byrd was. A few people were, but a lot of people weren't. And we had to have a 15-year-old girl lead the way. And so I covered the trial, and she won on half of her points and lost on half. But she made a statement, and she did win on some of her points. And those jurors, who were very conservative and very religious, sided with her on a lot of the issues. So I don't think people want to give up the Constitution if they're aware of it. But again, it's people like us listening on the radio in this room who have to lead the fight. We have to. Sorry.
At the risk of sounding obsequious, I want to thank you. I'm really glad that you're doing what you're doing, and I'm glad that you're teaching journalism. I haven't read your book, but I subscribe to The Nation, and I thought that article, Rust and Rage in the Heartland, was wonderful, and I've Xeroxed it and mailed it to Germany and all over. And one of the things, my friends and I, people frequently ask each other, how can anybody vote for Bush? And one of the things that article did, I think, was really offer an explanation of why and how that happens. But the other thing I want to say, I also have a fear, many actually, but one is just the control of the media now. The fact that media is owned by big corporations, and there's more and more consolidation. And when you've encouraged your students, to sort of get these stories in there somehow, and the editors resist and so forth. I just wonder where we're heading, how we can turn this situation around in this country in the media.
Well, the great thing about I teach journalism differently now than I did when I started 14 years ago. There's a lot of alternative weeklies around the country where you can get some good stories and actually some better journalism than the daily papers. I think of Austin, Texas, for example. There's the Austin Chronicle. They run like 2 open pages on the city council meeting every week, and it's the most. I visit town once in a while. What do I care about the Austin City Council meeting? I read the whole thing every time. It's so well written. The Austin Statesman, owned by Gannett, is horrible. So there's little rays where these alternative voices are coming out. But again, they don't hit the mainstream. The question earlier about the person working, the poor working person isn't going to pick up the Austin Chronicle. So you are kind of right into the elite. But there are ways, and with the web now, that's how I learned about Katie's story. That's how I learned about the mosque. The web saves me. So there was an internet underground over Katie Sierra. 3,300 Google hits on her at one point. 2 on Nexus in American newspapers, buried deep in the story. She was never really written about. I tried to sell a story on Katie. Nobody wanted to buy it. But you have to just keep fighting. There's ways to battle stories in. If you can't get it in this venue, go to that venue.
Come to the microphone and ask your question. The gentleman in the back.
Excuse me if you already mentioned this, but as you journeyed throughout America, did you find Americans to be more sympathetic or compassionate to terrorism abroad as a result of their experience with 9/11?
Among the elite, there's an awareness of it, but the average American, thinks of they're going to be attacked. So I didn't hear too much in my travels of worrying about what's going to happen in Spain or France. We're kind of an insular country. I don't like it, but we are. So yeah, I didn't really hear much about that.
How about maybe more nuanced, maybe more like in certain regions of the country that had a greater concern with international affairs? Maybe that had something to...
Oh, in the People's Republic of New York or People's Republic of San Francisco, that's very true. But, you get between those 2 cities. No, not really.
Do you find America to be not exactly provincial, but somewhat parochial?
Well, we've always been that way. But that's in their book.
Okay. And that kind of insulates us and keeps many Americans either indifferent or ignorant about world affairs.
Yes.
I want to ask you one last question, and this goes back to the article in The Nation. You hope John Kerry finds his inner FDR. Do you see leaders out there who exhibit traces of an inner FDR? Is there somebody who can inspire the way FDR did and who can bring people together and allay their fears the way FDR did?
Maybe that politician's at a statewide level right now. I don't know him or her. I look at Barack Obama, and maybe him. He goes to Republican audiences and tells them, I have to raise your taxes, and he wins them over by the end. I've not actually heard him speak, but I've read these stories, and he sounds incredible. But somebody even more out there, more innovative in their thinking. That may be my next book. I want to do a sequel to Homeland. I have no idea what it's going to be, but I may go search for those kind of voices, because there is actually, despite the fact that I talk rather grim sometimes, there's a lot of hope in Homeland. But I want to do a book or people showing to the next level how we can get there. I think that's the next step for us. And for me as a journalist, that's my job. Should I choose to accept it, and I do.
Thank you, Dale Maharidge.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Cambridge Forum, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For a CD of this program entitled Homeland, recorded in October 2004, send a check or money order for $12 to Cambridge Forum, 3 Church Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts 02138, or visit us on the web at www.cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Pat Zerke. Thank you for joining.